It's the bird emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I am a bird nerd, and I love to do this show because I get to speak to some people whose names I recognise on bird books that I've had or articles that I've read when I've been sitting like a weirdo in the state library reading all the journals that I can't possibly afford to buy. So it's a great pleasure. I am having this great pleasure of speaking with Dr. Rohan Clarke. How are you, Rohan?
G'day, Grant. I'm well. Thanks for having us.
Look, I'm delighted that you said that you'd have a chat with us. Um, Now I'm having a guess. I reckon that I might actually have a year or two more on the clock than you. Um, but we probably grew up cheering for the same cricketers or the same high leaping forwards in on the footy field or something like that.
Yeah, I reckon
But
that's probably pretty close.
but I've been seeing your name in print for such a long time, um, looking at a lot of the birds that as a youngster, I'll say a youngster because I think in our 20s we're still learning the craft when we're out in the field. How can you remember what your first publication was and what it was in?
I can actually. So the first one that I ever wrote was on bristle birds, eastern bristle birds, and it was a little project I did in far eastern Victoria with How Flat and surveying the birds there, and then all the way down the coast to Lakes Entrance to see if we could find any other locations. And it was in Australian Birdwatcher, which is now Australian Field Ornithology.
And when was that the first one?
Oh, now you've got me. I wouldn't know the date. Yeah, maybe sometime in the 90s, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
But yeah, I'm terrible at dates. Yeah, ask me something
yeah.
about birds.
I'd be thinking somewhere around 95, 96. Would that have been
Yeah,
around the
that might
time?
be right. But honestly, can't recall. So yeah, but I
Yeah,
do know
yeah,
that was the first birdie thing I wrote that was published. So yeah.
yeah. And did you did you always have the bird bug, or were you interested in a wide range of sort of nature and environmental things, issues at at in the formative years?
Bird bug from a very early age. Self-funded in inverted commas my binoculars when I was in primary school. Self-funded in that clearly there was a lot of parental support there. And had a bird book, a field guide back then as well. But I was also quite active in both the Junior Field Nats Club and the Victorian Field Nats Club in my teens. And then, since then, I do ecology, but quite focused on birds most of the time. So,
Okay, now for non-Australian listeners and perhaps even non-Victorian listeners, bear with us for just a minute as I get all nostalgic and go down memory lane. Rowan, were you a member of the of the Gould League of Bird Lovers?
no, I wasn't. But the link was when I was, it must have been primary school, all of my walls in my bedroom were covered in those
Those
classic Gould
posters.
League posters. Yeah, so there's a
Okay.
connection there. I may have been just a little bit late in terms of when it was really active, but yeah, definite
And
link.
and were you collecting their handbooks? I think they were called the handbooks to the birds of Victoria.
Yep.
Um, so
Yeah, I know the birds of farmland and open country might be one, and
uh,
coastal
num,
areas and wetlands or
nu-
something.
yeah, number one, urban birds. Number two, forests. Number three, uh, coastlines, estuaries, and
That's the one.
rivers.
Yep.
Uh, Number four, I think number four had the Azure flycatcher on the Azure flycatcher, Azure kingfisher. Then
Yep.
number five dryland and Mallee, or was that the farmland one? Five, six, and seven. Sort of, I I graduated. I was onto the Slater Field Guides, volumes one and two by then. And the big prize, you'll probably remember this. Do you remember when the Reader's Digest Every Australian Bird Illustrated came out? The massive coffee table size
blue book.
Yeah,
Yes.
the blue
Yep.
book with the
that.
sunbirds. Yeah, so
classic works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of graduated from those volume 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, and I had an uncle and auntie who had moved for a couple of years to New Zealand, and New Zealand had a 2-volume handbook that was sponsored by Fiat, the Fiat Motor Company of all things, and at about the same time they sent me over these 2 books of a field guide to the birds of New Zealand, which just blew my mind.
Amazing. Yep.
Oh, it was. It just catches you, doesn't it? So it hung around with you for so long. Now, bear with me, Rohan. I just want to. I'm going to read until people get sick of me. Your Monash page for your projects. Now, part of what we're going to talk about today, you're talking about establishing Australia's scalable drone cloud. So there's a couple there. Population assessment of the eastern bristle bird. Now that's really stayed with you. And the survey for the mainland ground parrot. Spatial ecology of Pterodroma petrels. Fitness consequences of admixture between locally adapted lineages in an Australian bird. Everybody's favourite, the eastern yellow robin, of course, on the cover of Volume 2 of the infamous Slater Guides. High-end sensors for monitoring and management of threatened species. Something which I was a nut when I was a kid. The helmeted honeyeater. Offshore turbines and seabirds. The Norfolk Island moorpork. Monitoring of seabirds on the Cocos keelings. More seabirds. There's just so much. Norfolk Island, Christmas Island.
So it's a grab bag of all things bird, but it probably is also really reflective of some really good collaborations and good people that we work with that help bring those things together. So which ones you flagged? Eastern yellow robins and helmeted honeyeaters, and their collaborations with Paul Sunnick's lab, who leads brilliant projects in that space and with great students.
And I didn't know until recently that you'd done a lot of work on the Mallee emu wren, which of course is one of my favourites, and you've been studying translocations or reintroductions. So
yeah, absolutely.
Of course, I've spoken to Simon Verdon about his project. So it goes to show that in so many different ivory towers, as so many people like to refer to universities and other research centres, the common threads and the problems are evident, and they're being worked on. So let's leap right into it. Let's jump to the end first. Why are we still failing so badly when there's so much great work? The research is out there. Why do you think we can't cut through at a political level and actually get decision makers to do what you and people like you have been telling us needs to be done for 30 years?
Yeah, it's a genuine challenge, right? And I think you're right in that we broadly know what to do, and we know where the biggest threats lie. And if I was going to paraphrase those now, the biggest impending threat, the thing that's coming, is climate change. But the other really big threats are habitat loss. That's a core driver of almost all of the declines that we see. And then there's a bunch of other things that are incremental on those bigger problems. So habitat loss removes opportunity for species to occur there. But then if you couple that with predation pressure from invasive species, with weeds, with some forms of landscape modification, so habitat's still there, but it's not as good, and a whole suite of other things that might be a little bit more species specific, the threats are broad and varied, but ideally we should be starting at the top and then dealing with some of those other threats in parallel. And we often don't seem to be able to do that at a political, social sort of level. And we also seem to be reluctant to tackle the big issues that would get the biggest changes if we manage to deal with them successfully. So, habitat loss and, as I touched on, climate change. There's not, for the train wreck that's coming, there's still not a lot of appetite to genuinely respond to it. So.
I don't know if you want to step into this field. I'm springing this on you. It wasn't in my in my 6 dot points that we talked about, but I'm continually frustrated when I've lived in East Gippsland and seen the logging trucks coming up and down the roads and whatnot. It's just part of life. But when you actually realise that there's less than 300 jobs that are dependent on cutting down old growth and established regrowth forests in Victoria. Now, I'm not saying that the forest industry is only 300 people, but there's only about 300 jobs that are dependent on that particular timber. All the rest of it can be substituted. You don't need to cut down mountain ash and shining gums to make window frames and to make decking and fence posts and struts, fencing struts and stuff like that. Everything else can be substituted. I'm 56 now, Rohan. This was an issue when I was 15.
Yeah.
How do you feel as somebody who's out there collecting and analysing the data and advising the department and the decision makers? No doubt you've had to sit on round tables with politicians of all sorts of stripes and probably captains of industry. And how do you feel as someone who's out there doing the work when we continually don't do what we know we need to do?
It's hard. I mean, all of that is really happening in the social and political sphere. The reality is that from an ecological standpoint, we mostly know what we need to do with those big, broad things. And you've mentioned logging, but, there's a bunch of other things in that same space. And I'm not an economist, but it's a no-brainer that there's far more value in the Central Highlands, for example, with tourism and recreational use. Just mountain bikes alone in some of those areas would easily eclipse the number of jobs that are created through forestry.
But probably by multiples of 50,
Yeah, and there's ways of making those things work. So, it's not to argue that mountain bike trails in every bit of forest are also desirable, but mixed use of forest that's retained for its ecological values and for the benefits that as a society we also get out of it. Melbourne's border catchments and the outstanding example, but there's a whole lot of other really clear benefits of those forests. It does beg a belief that we seem incapable of making more rapid transitions when we know what the benefit is and why we should do it. And there's some super interesting history here because some of the reason we have those forests is because they were set aside for logging. And so some of the reason we have some of our national parks and some of our really important state reserves is they were set aside for beekeepers. And so, but it doesn't mean that, 3, 5, 6 decades on, when we figure there's actually a much better way of managing that and there's other things we could do to get, extract those other resources, that we shouldn't transition. But I think, it's also worth recognising the history of it and the links and how we need to do it sensitively as well. So.
Oh, totally. I mean, forestry was such a key industry in the development of large parts of Victoria and probably everywhere else in the eastern parts of the country, certainly Tasmania. So, I don't think any of us are saying forestry is bad, but hey, when forestry was so important. We didn't know a lot of the things that we know now, and also, hey, we didn't have mobile phones back then. So if people are saying, well, we should be doing things the way we've always been doing them, well then, to stop
Yeah.
driving on freeways, go and hitch up your buggy, your horse and cart, and if you've got to go to town, just go down to Cobb and Co and jump on board.
Yeah, well, we're moving on and forward, and and that technology also gives us a whole lot of capacities to do better things in other places as well. So we should be grabbing that wherever we can as well.
Well, there we go. You've let me forward away from my favourite hobby horse. I'll just put a bit of context, Rowan. I get so frustrated because I was in student politics around the voluntary student union days when Kennett was in power, and all the parks and gardens people who were highly skilled, and we had all these beautiful streetscapes, all were sacked and had to reapply for their jobs, and everything was outsourced. And I gave away my age before. I was in my mid-20s, I think, when I went and did my horticulture course. Now, we were the garden state. People were really proud of our streetscapes. But a few years after all that, when just cutting street trees to straight lines and all that came in, people were saying, but we used to have such beautiful streetscapes. What happened? The whole industry was telling everyone what was going to happen. It was everyone predicted exactly the butchering of the street trees, that the slow decline, that they would senesce over time, they'd all be being removed. Gee, nobody could have seen this happening. That's the lament of this year, isn't it? Oh, nobody could have seen this COVID doing what it did. Rubbish. You just didn't want to listen because it was inconvenient to do things. And anyway, technology, Rowan. Let's talk about how drones specifically. Let's start with drones, but then maybe we can talk about bioacoustic monitoring and whatnot as well.
Yep.
Are you able to do more with less these days in terms of dollars and also people in surveillance and monitoring? Tell us some of the great projects that you've worked on in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, so we've been across quite a few drone projects. I think the first ones were around 2013 or 14 when we were flying drones at Ashmore. And at that stage, we were still hacking cameras to make them take a photo every second with a little bit of code off the web. The camera was strapped on and a bit of gaffer tape included to the drone. The drone was a Meccano set from the US, and we had a generator on the beach to keep the batteries charged up through the day. Step forward, 6-7 years, and the off-the-shelf Phantom 4 that you can buy now does all of that and more, and it does it at a way better resolution. I think at the start there was perhaps a little bit of a fear from ecologists that maybe we were going to keep everyone out of the field and it would all be done with tech. But the reality is you still need good ecologists on the ground and good tech operators, and sometimes that's the same person, a drone pilot and an ornithologist or an ecologist. So we're still doing lots of field work, but we're just doing it better and hopefully smarter. And the tech is allowing us to do it both more efficiently, but also to get more out of the same. So if we're monitoring, that means more precision, like much more accurate counts that allows us to be more confident that populations are or aren't changing with time, for example. And knowing that quickly is really important for management. So some of the projects, I touched on Ashmore Reef. We started by flying over seabird colonies at Ashmore. We were able to show, with a bunch of really good people involved, that we could get an order of magnitude higher precision. So closer, every count that we did with a drone was closer to every other count we did with a drone, compared to having 3-4 people standing shoulder to shoulder and all counting the birds with a spotting scope. So when you stand on the ground counting birds sitting on nests, we think we're great at it. when we compare it to aerial images, we're an order of magnitude less good. So, it's a pretty massive a decline in precision if you compare those two. And so that boosts your power to be able to detect changes in populations with time.
Are you at the point where you've been at it long enough and using the same methodology that AI is able to do most of the counting, that analysis work for you?
I'd say we're on the cusp. So AI has been around a little while, and it does some really good things with some large databases. And so just recently I was talking to people about iNaturalist and the fact that, there's millions of tagged images in there, and there's a QA process that means those images kind of get uplifted or downrated depending on how many people agree on the ID, and that's all feeding into the AI process. And so that's the challenge for us and for most other groups working in this space, is building those large tagged data sets, because you need to train your artificial intelligence to start with. There is an approach where you don't train it, where you get it to go and figure out what's in the images and things. But, if we're interested in a particular component, great frigate bird nests, for example, telling them that these are great frigate bird nests is the best start.
There's got to be some... Sorry, Ro, there's got to be some good stories, doesn't there, if you've let the AI run rogue on the identification that, has anyone or has the AI ever turned up a fig parrot on Ashmore Reef?
Not to our knowledge yet, but that's where we're at in terms of capability. So, there's outputs now that are, say, generic AI for detecting any bird in any setting in an aerial image. So flamingo on a salt lake, tree nesting seabird, through to some small bush bird flying through the image, and it can say bird. And so then what you want to do with those broad classifications is refine them for your focal species, your study species, your targets. And so if it's seabirds on islands in colonies, then that's not that big a task. You just need to go and tag 50, 100 images, ideally maybe with 1,000 birds in it tagged that are correctly identified, and then away you go again, and your AI starts doing that. And it may be that the process is not 100%, and so there's two things you could do. One is you could accept that AI only picks up 70%, but that's your monitoring tool, and you go away and use that. And the other is that you use someone to sit at a desktop and physically go and search for that other 30% that are missing. And both of those are more efficient than having someone look for 100% of birds in an image and tag them all from the start. So that's sort of, essentially where we're at. I'd say, today, and in a year or two, we'll have moved on, and AI presumably will be driving most of it.
So one of the things I like to talk about, and it probably bores people to snores, Rohan, but how much work you get out of a small PhD grant. So maybe there's $20,000 allocated to a PhD project, which has basically got to buy petrol and feed and house a PhD candidate for a period of time. How much change would you get out of, say, 10,000 for the drone and the access to the AI? I'm imagining that it's either university property, or that you need to lease access from some much bigger entity. So how does it stack up in terms of costs? Because I know people don't like talking about it when they're in the field, but I think people who are hobbyists and just bird nerds, nature buffs like me, don't really have an idea of what absorbs the cost in a project. Let's talk about Ashmore Reef. Next time,
that one's off the charts. It mightn't be the best example, but I can scare you with some numbers.
There's huge travel costs just to get to Ashmore Reef. For those who don't know, Ashmore Reef's off the northwest coast of Western Australia. But one of the projects you were doing was monitoring eastern bristle birds, and because you're in the same kind of habitat, you're looking at the mainland ground parrot, the eastern ground parrot as well. How far does 20 grand go for a 12-month project to
Yeah,
monitor
so
Bristol
maybe
birds?
if I reframe the question to my advantage,
Yeah.
so let's say 21,000 over a PhD,
Yeah.
and 21 over a PhD is roughly 7,000 a
Per year.
year,
Yeah.
and that recognises that we would normally do 2.5 field seasons. So ideally you'd do 3 because it's more data, but there's constraints in terms of write up and the like. I want my students to kind of have, to do good science and to get good outcomes and write a good thesis and learn through that process. But I want them to have a formative experience in terms of being in the field, getting their hands dirty, learning, doing ecology on the ground, and almost everything that we do is applied. So we're looking for answers to questions that will typically help management, find, identify threats, find solutions, and those sorts of things. That sort of money would reasonably fund those sorts of PhDs. So, if you had a PhD, or we have PhDs running on Norfolk Island, that gets you 1 or 2 field trips a year. That's flights. There's accommodation. It's an offshore island, so there's accommodation when you're on island. You can't camp, for example. There's some food costs, and then there's trackers and things like that. If you need lots of trackers, which are expensive, so some of that tech, then you'd need another grant over and above that. But when you think about it, this is, if you compared that to a full-time ecologist working on the same project on celery, then there's relatively little change out of 100K per year. And before everyone goes, you all get paid 100,000 a year to be an ecologist.
Ivory towers.
That job. There's
Tree hugging ivory towers.
Exactly. There's a reality of on costs and a bunch of other things that don't get realised in salaries and are off the scene. So that's just what it costs as a package. But actually, salaries that people draw are less than that is the reality. It's incredibly cheap. But I guess we're not trying to do it to be cheap. We're trying to best use what are typically awesome grant opportunities to get good conservation outcomes whilst training PhDs. And we want our PhDs to then go on and get good, productive, long-term jobs in those spaces as well. So it's not about just using PhD students cheaply and then chucking them on the pile. It's about them transitioning into a career that sees them paid well for the things that they're now trying to do as well. So,
yeah, I didn't want to try and give the impression that it's a good way to get cheap results.
No,
but I just think people don't understand actually in this field how far $7,000 goes in a year. I mean, try and get $7,000 filming an infomercial about something, or to ask an advertising executive how much $7,000, what proportion of a minute $7,000 will buy you on a Coke ad, and how extremely important that work is. That 48 seconds that it might buy you. That's extremely important stuff. Editorial.
Yeah, so you can come at it from two ways, right? Yeah. Like we're doing our absolute best to spend what are quite meager funds, but massively appreciated when they're coming from granting bodies and the like, to get good outcomes for students that are doing the work and good outcomes for species and conservation. But flip that, and you can argue, why aren't these things that should be really important funded to a much, much higher level?
Look, koalas are currently in vogue because the government's going to put money into repairing koala habitat, while at the same time allowing you to cut down koala habitat. Absolutely insane. But allied to that, which nobody has ever talked about, how many tourists would be coming to Australia if there were no koalas? If the only place that you could see a koala is the same place that you could see the grandchildren of Steve Irwin.
Absolutely. And the list, where do I start? Kakadu,
Yeah,
Great Barrier Reef, koalas, birding tourism. These are all, they're real, and they're worth an awful lot of money to the economy. Way more than most of the things we'll touch on that are in the other spaces.
Yeah,
So,
but it's frustrating, isn't it? What I suppose heading off in a direction that I didn't want to go, but well, actually, I always want to go here. But whenever we talk, not you and I, but when the general news media and the political class talk about what if we stopped logging? Imagine all the money we'd miss out on. It would be terrible if we stopped this. It would be huge economic costs. Where are the committed environmentalists / ecologists / economists who are pushing the other barrow? It's very difficult to find anybody who will take a sort of financial point of view about the value of the helmeted honeyeater, for want of the Mallee emu wren. How much is the Mallee emu wren worth to Oyen?
Probably quite a bit.
That's right, but
yeah.
I mean, compared to the countless trucks that drive through Oyen and stop off for lunch at the bakery, I mean, they'll always quantify a certain kind of tourism, but don't we have any friendly economists? I mean, you've been in the game a long time.
No, absolutely, we do, and there's good people doing work in that space, and there is some good crossover between ecologists and economists and the like. David Lindemeyer would spring to mind in terms of work on Central Highlands and forestry, and drawing in that information to get it out there. It does seem that it sometimes it's quite hard to get a voice in that space, and sometimes I guess that reflects that industry is much more tied to the economy and has a greater capacity to kind of almost claim it as their own, versus some of these other the spaces. So biodiversity conservation may not be quite so much viewed as an industry, and so we have less capacity to kind of make those links. But some of it's also, I guess, just how broad the fields are. I mean, you rattled off a list, a bunch of projects that I'm involved in with collaborations. Imagine if I threw in a bunch of economy projects and a bunch of others. There's a point where you get too spread, and so we need other people to help pick up the baton for some of those as well, and run with expertise in those spaces.
I wonder whether it's because there are vested interests supporting the work that benefits those industries, so that they can fund a PhD candidate to do that kind of work, whereas nobody in the ecology field is going to spend the annual $7,000 for a PhD candidate on an economic analysis, because there's important field work to be done. To stop a development or slow a development, there's actually urgent priorities competing for that time, effort, and financial resources.
Yeah, and I mean, it does come back to that social and political interaction, which admittedly is not my space, but it's big and it's a challenge. I would pick you up on one little thing. You said stop developments. I guess I don't see I don't wear the cap of stop developments. I wear the cap of find solutions. Sometimes developments are okay.
Thanks for picking me up on that. What I mean is, when a development is proposed, it's always pushed as a positive. There's always net positives for a development. That's always the starting point. And then everyone has to rally around and prove why it will be bad, if indeed it will be bad. Whereas, as you just picked me up, and I'm glad you did, and I'm hugely interested in this stuff, having been a horticulturist and worked on streetscapes and whatnot, always amazed at how using that public space, the developments that are going to occur, because houses are going to be built, roads are going to be built. why not turn the whole development and the roads into corridors? You have to plant vegetation. There are going to be trees planted in there, so why not pull it all together? But that's never the starting point. That's always an add-on after there's been objections or something, or here's the crappiest parcel of land in the development. Here, public space.
We'll use that. Yeah.
Do what you like with it. Oh, thank you. Are you not merciful? And you either get the worst bit of land, or you generally get a piece of land that can't be used for anything else. Is going to be the most costly to put a house or a road, or they can't use it for drainage.
Basin in the middle becomes the wetland because it was never going to be a house. Yeah,
that's right. So I look. Anyone who's listened to any of the shows knows that I get lost down that rabbit hole because it's so frustrating. Because I've worked for companies that develop those new greenfield sites. All that Hoppers Crossing, Altona, right down. I put the irrigation into a whole heap of those projects, and I got out of that industry because nobody gave a shit about anything other than the bottom line, which is really frustrating because when wildlife needs to move, and there's always wildlife that is still in those fringe areas, but it needs to move, and we can accommodate that without any extra dollars, because you've got to spend the dollars on streetscapes. You've got it, but imagine if we didn't have to rely on partly volunteered staff, seed collectors, Indig seed and Indig nurseries. Imagine if there was actually a massive ornamental horticulture industry that was built around that as much as it is around bloody grafted Largostromias, crepe myrtles and hydrangeas, and none of it's a stupid idea. It's just that nobody's.
We've definitely still got a little way to go.
So, what's the current management trend for? Let's talk about the Regent Honeyeater for a minute, if you don't mind, because I was struck when I was reading one of your papers, and I think it was probably from 2015, or it might have even been a little bit earlier, where one of the problems for reintroductions of captive bred Regent Honeyeaters was that sugar gliders were predating the nests. So that's a massive management problem. So what kind of approaches have been put in to solve that problem? Because reintroductions of Regent Honeyeater, I think, are going to keep happening, but the population continues to decline. And don't get me started on clearing box woodland.
Well, I mean, I guess that's it, right? So it's so the Regent Honeyeater plight, what it faces is because of vegetation clearance. That's the driver. It's a bird that wanders over vast areas of southeastern Australian woodlands, and as you fragment that and reduce the total available habitat, it gets harder to survive in that landscape. So it might do really well for a few years, but then you have a year where it fails to flower in a particular area, and normally they'd move to another area. That area is not available, they're out. And so then you sort of step through all of those other little problems. We, as conservation biologists, we're not the ones revegetating the entire landscape, although there's been some phenomenal efforts in that space, particularly for Regent Honeyeaters. We're looking at how we can get those other incremental gains to conserve the species. And so understanding what happens to breeding birds and how many chicks they're able to produce is a really important one. And as you flagged, we stuck a bunch of video cameras on wild/natural nests, and quite quickly learnt that nest predation from both sugar gliders and squirrel gliders was happening. That's natural. It's probably been happening forever and a day. It's just historically that would have been a sustainable take on those nests because there were lots of regent honeyeaters and they could sustain that. When you've only got 5 nests in Victoria or 10 nests in New South Wales, if 2 of them are lost to squirrel gliders and sugar gliders, suddenly that becomes a really big problem for the species. And so that's where we are. And we tried a bunch of different exclusion cages and the like to see if we could get better outcomes. And so this is a bunch of cool trials where we made nests that looked like regent honey in a nest. We baited them with quail eggs and plasticine eggs. And then we put a cage around a suite of them and no cage on the controls. And then we looked at the predation rates for those 2 types of nests. And what we were able to show is that most birds that predate nests, so grey striped thrush and a few others, are really common predators of these nests. They don't mind. They're quite happy to hop inside a cage and take the eggs. And we had mammals doing the same, hopping inside cages and taking the eggs. So that management technique doesn't look to be suitable. But the really important thing in terms of that study is we now know it's not suitable. And so for a number of years, the recovery team had been talking about, maybe we could try, nest cages, and maybe that would, and then there's a bit of reluctance because if we put nest cages on the 5 nests we've got and they all fail, because we put a nest cage on because the regent honeyeaters don't, then we're in trouble. And so there was this sort of interplay and pull within the team where some were reluctant to trial the method and others were keen. But we've got this kind of method sitting in the back of the room as maybe it's a possibility. We did the trials without regent honeyeaters. It doesn't look like it works. We need to find other solutions. And so sometimes those sort of 0 results, the negative results, are also really important because it helps you frame what your toolbox might look like going forward. And so that's where we got with those nests.
So, are you the least bit optimistic about the regent honeyeater?
I'm pretty pessimistic about regent honeyeaters. I think I've said it publicly a couple of times. They're in real trouble. They're now, I think it would be reasonable to say, functionally extinct, gone in Victoria. In my lifetime, that's been a change in that Chiltern and a few other places, when I was a kid, they were still relatively accessible as free-flying wild birds with no captive releases or anything. Pretty much any bird that's detected in Victoria now is a captive release bird, or possibly, if we're lucky, some progeny from those. New South Wales is not far behind. The numbers are in the hundreds and optimistically sometimes the high hundreds. I suspect it's a bit lower than that, but I'm not the one doing the modelling and counting and the like. But, that's dire straits for a bird that moves over huge areas. This is not 100 regent honeyeaters that live in one little pristine valley that might be okay for the next 20 years. This is a few hundred regent honeyeaters spread over tens of thousands of square kilometres, trying to find each other, trying to find resources, trying to breed successfully, trying to, move around a landscape that's not what it was 50, 80, 100 years ago.
I mean, there's been a lot of publicity recently with some of the work that Ross Case had done about the songs and the inability of generations to pass on sort of the contact calls that they need to establish the social bonds and to get together and to mate. If it's functionally extinct and we are not we're not taking seriously preserving existing habitat, and I don't think anybody can say that certainly the New South Wales government is taking preservation of that habitat seriously. I think the Victorians have it's already too late, as you've sort of said here. There's just so little habitat left. Is there an ethical issue about whether we should be diverting or spending resources on that species anymore when there may be others that we could potentially intervene and make a difference? And is that something that you and your colleagues, because of course you're in touch with every ecologist, conservation biologist in the world, so you can speak for your for your colleagues.
Not.
Um, and
Well,
is that
it's the whole triage discussion, right? And it's what you do in times of crisis. Some could argue that with the meager amount of funding that we've got, we should be doing different things, but often that the political will is actually to give it to the things that are most in crisis as well. So it's actually hard to achieve funding for something that's sort of threatened, but so threatened meaning it's been assessed as going to go extinct at some time in a reasonable period of time, but low on that threatened list. It's hard to get the funding for that. You get funding for the things that are in absolute crisis. So one of the sort of the mechanism and the priority there. But the other is that, for the cost of some submarines, we could fund everything that's of value in terms of a biodiversity sense and pull it all together. And some of these things like regent honeyeaters are not, they're not being dealt with in isolation. So a lot of the land covenanting, the protection of the best habitats has very direct flow-on effects for all of those other species that occupy those same land systems. But if you're trying to do it for the rare dunnart in that same area, or the uncommon gecko, you wouldn't get anywhere near as much traction as using the critically endangered regent honeyeater to achieve the same outcome. So no, I don't think we should walk away from the most threatened. I still don't think we're quite there yet in terms of sort of the triage requirement. But gee, it'd be nice if we could see a system where we could better protect everything. The funding's not really that big an issue; it's the will.
Yeah. You mentioned submarines, and I don't think we need to even sacrifice one submarine. I think we could sacrifice maybe one of the new tanks, or perhaps the drive shaft of a submarine, and we would be able to get tangible results in the conservation space. But nobody in government is out there saying, well, and you made the point too, if you protect the habitat for the regent honeyeater, you protect the dunnart, you protect the gecko, you protect the wood-boring beetles, you protect whatever butterflies are there, you protect the intact eucalypt woodland community that so many organisms depend on. You get massive bang for your buck. But we still don't seem to have been able to get into the majority of the population that, and climate change is allied to all this, but you can't afford to lose one, because there's always a knock-on effect for something else. And if I say one, I might talk about an existing habitat, intact habitat. We all know this. We all love David Attenborough. We all watch Blue Planet and everything. We all understand it. Why? I get frustrated. Why do you think it is that we can't relate it back to our everyday activities?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's some of it's scientific literacy, and that doesn't mean that everybody needs to be a scientist, but just understanding, the value of science and the way science delivers solutions to problems. If society was more on board with that, and we could go much, much broader than biodiversity, we'd be in a very different place. Purely from a selfish point of view for humans, the value that biodiversity brings to us is just, it's immeasurable. It's what keeps our planet ticking. And people just don't seem to grasp that, the value of invertebrates for pollination, for crops, for, dot, 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 dot. I could spend the rest of the day talking about the value of biodiversity to humans. before we start thinking about it, because we should protect it because it's got intrinsic value, its own value in its own right as well. Ultimately, if we lose regent honeyeaters, humans won't be worth off in a material sense, but there's that intrinsic value that's lost, and that goes so much broader than that. And if we're prepared to chip away at things like regent honeyeaters, we're essentially chipping away at biodiversity in our planet. And that's the reason why we should stop it and turn it around. And that's the reason why everybody should care. And then there's a cohort of people that also care because they value biodiversity for what it is.
I want to ask you something that's just come to mind when I was thinking about the work you do. The value of the ecosystem as a whole, climate change, fires that are so impactful that we've had in Western Australia just in the last few days, and of course we remember in Victoria the catastrophic loss of habitat in recent years. Do you, as and I'm asking you this because you mentioned the lab, you refer to your workplace at Monash as a lab, and that other people running subjects and running courses also work in labs.
Yep.
Do you feel valued as a scientist, albeit we're saying in an applied sense, in the same way that somebody in a lab, in a white coat, mixing stuff together in test tubes and then getting on the news talking about the new pill to stop people getting fat, are valued? Like, do you...
Tough question.
Yeah, well...
yeah. I'd say yes, but part of the challenge there is that we're all in our own echo chambers, right? So I interact with other biologists, conservation biologists, birders, people that are interested in natural history. I interact with a bunch of people beyond that as well, but that is the sphere within which I'm in. And so, those interactions and that positive feedback is largely in that space. But we also, we do get good traction in a broader public sphere for, some of the actions we do and some of the good outcomes we get. So I think there's value, society generally values these things. It is tied back to that scientific literacy though, and whether a good proportion of people fully understand what that win means more broadly for the thing that you're working on. But that might also apply to the people that are working in a lab and working out how to bust the next fat busting cell or whatever it is as well. Like the capacity to kind of appreciate that 60-second grab in the news towards the end about something that's exciting and a bit quirky that's just happened may have much broader ramifications beyond the quirkiness that the media put the spin on for you. I think is often lost.
Something that pisses me off, and I'm going to get this off my chest, is there's so much great work being done, and all of our TV networks have got shows that need to fill 2 or 3 hours in the morning going blah, 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 blah. Kanye West did this, some other pop star I've never heard of did this or reacted to someone else's Instagram thing and blah, blah, blah. Why the hell isn't Koshi or whoever the other ones are, I only know Koshi because of football really, why don't they have every week or even every day the 3.5 minute segment with Dr. Rohan Clarke talking about something, or what
doesn't need to be me, shouldn't be me.
No,
but absolutely, in terms of that.
I mean, there is space they have to fill, and they have this enormous amount of time they have to fill on programs, so that if I watch ABC News Breakfast or whatever it's called in the morning, I'll get 6 crosses to some idiot sitting in front of a green screen at Parliament House saying, well, something might happen today. There might be a meeting about something and it might happen. And there'll be 6, maybe 10 crosses. But nobody, they're not talking to nature guy or wonderful possum lady or, you know, or the cricket critter person or, you know, there's so many great people like, you know, who always comes to mind for me is Jodie Rowley talking about frogs, right?
Yeah.
What,
yeah, and I mean,
is it because
there's 2 there, right?
Is it because TV won't take it, or is it because people are not giving it to them because they've got to be fed, right? So,
surely if you build it, they will come. I think there's appetite there for it. I think part of the problem is when they do it, there's often a desire on the production of it to dumb it down as well. I mean, if you go back and look at, you know, Harry Butler in the Wild is kind of a classic series that was produced in Australia a long time ago now. If you watch some of that,
I remember it,
but it's not dumbed down.
No,
it's working through, you know, our understanding of ecology at that time, and how the different species of animal that he was throwing his hat on and catching and handling and talking about, how they all interact and where their special place is in the environment. It's not someone standing in a studio with a koala on their hip, where it's mostly about the host giggling and laughing and getting to pat it or hold it. It's like we've transitioned in terms of our exposure to nature as well, to the point that, you know, it's cheaper, shorter grabs basically.
Like the ABC just did that really, really great. I don't want to use the word great. It was really nice and it was really endearing show with Ann Jones about urban birds. And I mean, that's there's a big push on about urban birds, and I'm all on board with it. But why is the ABC not producing something every day? And
so I'd say that was great, right? Like that's the sort of stuff we should have. It's accessible. It was backed by science. It had people with authority speaking about things, and in that instance, it was also very relatable because, you know, it's traveling around an urban environment where the vast majority of Australians live, and showing us, an array of different, very cool stories. Some of which, present challenges. Noisy miners and pardalotes spring to mind, and others where there's good news stories because there's species winning in an urban environment that maybe we didn't expect. So powerful owls. And, that's what we need. We need more of that.
And I didn't mean to cast aspersions on it by being not a great program. Yeah. What I get frustrated with is that for 6 months or a year, everyone will talk about that program, right? And now, then I look at the repeat I saw while I was reading my notes, thinking about what we would talk about. ABC was running a repeat of Backroads. Now, Backroads is the perfect program where every one of those episodes, the producers should have hunted down somebody to talk about something about the ecology of the area that they talk about, or that, you know, maybe the comms people at all the universities should be reaching out to the producers of all of these programs saying, hey, look, you know, we've got this, and then offering up relevant ecologists, zoologists, population scientists, botanists, whoever, to get into the fabric of all these shows, because we're not as groovy as whatever Lizzo just did or whatever someone wore at the Academy Awards. Don't you just want to
disagree
bang
with
your
any
head?
of that?
Don't you just want to scream sometimes?
So, there are great people in, you know, the media space that are getting that message out. I mean, my argument is, and sure, I'm biased, but my argument is we need more of that.
Oh, absolutely.
I think
my argument is we need it on.
For it. So,
My argument is that the news producers should not be just feeding out the latest wonder drug. Every night there's a new wonder drug story. No, because that's all marketing bullshit. Please talk to Rohan or to Jody or to, the Fairy Wren Project or, Holly about Powerful Owls. Dude, just... And I know why networks do it, because it's easy. It gets fed to them. Here's the thing. The company's produced a little video they can run in the background while someone says what an amazing thing it's going to do in 40 years' time. But can't all the comms departments of all the unis and everything produce little packages for the news to run every night? The good news conservation story every night,
To a point, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
I've got to have some time to do my research as well.
But
and that's part of the challenge, right?
But Rohan, don't the universities employ people? I mean, I open my eyes up to this. I know the zoos do, because I can't talk to anyone from a zoo because the comms people won't put them on talking to me. But they will go and do a photo shoot with a minister holding a koala or standing under a tree, doing one of those things which actually, in my mind, is almost detrimental, because it allows the minister off the hook. Here, I'm doing something. Look at me, I'm doing something, and it must be good because the zoo is here, right? Maybe I'm just a contrarian about that, but I want the zoo telling us all their results. The good stuff, the bad stuff, everything they're doing. Not just 3 times a year wheeling out a minister because Twiggy Forrest flung 50 grand at you, or whoever it is. But that's how this stuff is tending to work now, that it's a PR opportunity for somebody else with a vested interest, and then the communications messages are managed. That's not the way to spread the message. That's just not the way. I mean, I'm not trained in PR, but it's not going to work because people see through it. They would much rather hear you or, the what have we got? Probably 500 working ecologists kicking around the country at the moment doing fantastic projects. Yeah. But no, Lizzo got upset with someone about something someone said on Instagram, so it's on the TV. That's just nutso to me. Anyway, I don't know how much further I can chase you down that rabbit hole. Where are we heading now, Rohan, with the technological developments? Do you think we'll be able to keep achieving more with less? Because inflation never stops. I don't think that your research funding for a PhD candidate is going to double in the next 5 years. So are we going to be able to keep getting the same bang for our buck or more bang for our buck with the assistance of technology?
In tech, I'd say yes. But it sort of ties back to some of the wins that you get in tech that may not be translated to less time on the ground or less cost collecting the data, but it might be improved data for the same effort, or higher precision counts, or a better understanding of all of the species in the system for about the same amount of field time. So we've talked a bit about drones and counting and getting much better precision with aerial images. But the same thing applies for acoustic recorders, for example, where if you've got AI capacity, and it's developing and getting better, but if you've got AI capacity to filter, very large data sets of songscape, so the sounds of the environment that you're in, the bush typically, then you potentially can filter for dawn, dusk, middle of the day, middle of the night, and pull out metrics on frogs, mammals, and birds that are vocal for about the same amount of field work that would require you to go and do a survey at each of those sites. So the field time may not change. You've got to go put the recorder out. You've got to pull it in. You've maybe changed batteries and the like. But but you end up with a much deeper data set with time, so long as the tech is there to support the extraction of the data. There's no good going collecting all the data and then spending 5 years in the lab downloading it all and getting it to a format that is then interpretable. So it's that data management where, or data collation, data interpretation, data management, where the tech is really coming to the fore. It's driving it. So,
is that a bottleneck for some of these projects, in that there's so much data being collected, but that you don't have the infrastructure or the resources back in the lab to process it and catalogue it and analyse it in a timely fashion to make it useful?
Oh, absolutely, for some projects. So, I mean, if you're doing bird surveys and you're carrying a digital recorder with you, so you're tapping in the data as you go, but you're still doing a traditional survey of, hear it or see it, record it, identify it, and log it. If that goes into a digital, platform while you're in the field, then there's very little processing required at the other end. Flip that, if you were looking at invertebrates and you want to understand, what prey is available for the Malleemia wren, and you're going to go and do a bunch of pitfall traps to catch insects and other invertebrate spiders and the like to see what's there, that generates a field data set of vials back in the lab that might take a year to process. There's certainly places where the field data collection is quick and the subsequent processing is a massive bottleneck, and there's others where that's not the case because a combination of just efficiency in terms of the way it's collected, but also tech allow you to get over that hump quickly.
And thanks for mentioning that, because for for the layman, for the people who aren't working in science, that's all part of the job. You might be studying a bird, but you have to become part entomologist. If you're working on seabirds, you have to understand fish and crustaceans and mollusks and so.
Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't mean that you're an expert in any or all of those spaces, but you need some understanding of those to, so like you said, diet of seabirds is a really important factor. It dictates where they go to hunt food out in an ocean system. So knowing what they eat, has a huge impact on that insight. We've stunk the entire floor out, probably the entire building, with regurgitated fish matter being sorted in our lab. So
okay, well,
the less glamorous stuff.
I want to crack on to ask you about a couple of things. Can we talk about the eastern bristlebird and the mainland ground parrot? I mean, the eastern ground parrot, because of course anybody who follows birds in Australia will know that the western ground parrot is hugely under threat because it's so localised in where it exists. But on the other side of the country, the eastern ground parrot was, we think, I'm hoping you're going to tell me, but my assumption was in the fires that we had a few years ago was that a lot of the eastern ground parrot habitat was affected by fire. Now, do we know what the current state of play is? And let's get you to first describe why the eastern ground parrot is a difficult bird to study and understand.
So they're this striking long-tailed parrot. As their name suggests, they spend almost all their time on the ground or very near the ground, foraging in grass and shrubs, or sedge and shrubs. They're camouflaged. You would not normally be able to walk up on them. So what normally happens is you hear them in the field doing this lovely high-pitched song, or you flush them. So they burst from near your feet and fly away. So detection's hard unless you're listening at dawn and dusk. They're a habitat specialist, so they're mostly in button grass, sedge, heathlands, and there's some influence of fire age class. So if it's very old, they don't seem to be in it, as in long unburnt. If it's very recently burnt, they don't seem to be in it. They need all of those seeds and fruits and flower buds and all sorts of other things to forage on. So they need some sort of diversity in their food. And on the Australian mainland, they're mostly coastal. So near coastal, probably within 10 to 15k of the coast is where almost all records are. As you move up to New South Wales, there's a few that sit up on some slightly more inland sites, but still within 100k of the coast. And they're all these little isolated pockets because they have that habitat specialisation. And then humans have come along and done a really good job of clearing the gaps between them. We build houses on the beach because they're nice places to have holiday houses, or where we build our cities. And so all of those little populations get more and more fragmented. And then we have things like the Black Summer fires that burn vast areas in a single event. So instead of a small fire that burns through a single heathland or part of a heathland, we raise the entire region in one go. And having flown over some of that soon after the fires, that was blackened to the beach. So there is no opportunity in the short term for birds in those areas. They either need to first survive the fire, and then they need to eke out an existence for weeks, months later before they can get back into suitable habitat. So that's the challenge with them. The status, it's pretty grim. I think that eastern ground parrots in quite a lot of areas are probably, and this is going to sound particularly grim, maybe just a few decades behind where they are in Western Australia. The Victorian plight must be, pretty extreme now. Populations that are relatively small in Wilson's Prom, and then just a handful of other sites where they've occurred and been detected post the fires. I'm not sure. I haven't been following really recently what the estimates are, but they're small. And these disturbances are predicted to keep coming. So there's a big challenge to try and work out what we've got and how we're best going to protect it.
Do you know if they take to captivity? Are they a species that is being bred in captivity?
So there's very serious attempts with Western ground parrot, and the Western ground parrot and the Eastern ground parrot, for all intents and purposes, ecologically are pretty similar. I haven't heard of success to the point that they've raised young, but they've had and maintained a captive population for quite a number of years to test that and develop that as a tool. If you can breed them in captivity and you've got fewer than 100 birds, well, then breeding them in captivity is a tool to use to boost the global population. I guess a fairly obvious thing to do would be trials with Eastern ground parrots, where we have a few more, and develop that. I'm a big one for collaboration. So there's absolutely some brilliant private aviculturalists in this space, people that devote their lives to keeping birds and doing a good job of it. And I think, whilst the zoos and the sanctuaries that, the registered zoos and sanctuaries do an excellent job, there's also incredible expertise in that private space as well, private agricultural space. And it'd be great to see all of those groups interacting to get really good outcomes. The system means that still means zoos and sanctuaries are going to lead, but having some of that expertise either contributing to captive husbandry or indeed having a small number of birds in the right places with the right keepers to get good outcomes is something that we should be exploring as well.
Eastern bristlebird occupies a lot of the same geographical locations, but not the same sort of niche. How are they faring? I mean, I've heard the Eastern bristlebird. I've never seen it. It's one of those birds that I spent a lot of time driving up and down the Crower-Jingalong coast, hoping I would get lucky. What's the state of play there? And at the same by the same token, are they likely to be a candidate for captive breeding and an insurance population?
Yeah. So there's they're in a different state to ground parrot. there's definitely some quite high threat for, say, the Victorian population, the most southerly birds, in the Australian and global population, and the same applies for the most northern populations. There's birds in captivity, so the northern population, some of those birds are being held at Currumbin and perhaps somewhere else. So there's captive husbandry and captive breeding underway to try and conserve representatives of those northern populations. We've got probably more tools for them than we have for eastern ground parrots. So there's been some really successful translocations in New South Wales where birds have been moved back to coastal sites, and populations have basically boomed at some of those sites. And so, we know a lot about how to catch them, how to move them, how to keep them in captivity. And so, some of the actions that are planned, translocations in Victoria, for example, it's probably fair to say have a better chance of succeeding because of that base knowledge that's already been developed. And ground parrots are just a little bit behind that in terms of where we're at and what we know and where all the solutions lie. But so, in a world where there's lots of things that are pretty grim, eastern bristlebirds may be one of those ones that we have more capacity to do, good things for them in the short, medium term as well.
So what's your gut feeling about whether we're going to start getting it right generally when it comes to preserving these at-risk habitats? Eastern Victoria is a perfect example of, for so long it was the wild place, and there was all the reservoirs of plant diversity and whatnot. But now the beach house, the second house, the country getaway is further and further from the city, which means all of these places are at risk, and there's going to be species that we never thought would come under any kind of threat may well be. Do you think in your working life that we might see a change in the way policy is set and delivered?
Oh, absolutely. I think, at finer scales, we see that all the time. So within departments, and I'm most familiar with what goes on in Victoria, but we've seen, transition from single focal species, perhaps to start with the most exciting species first. I mentioned koalas earlier, and then working on single species recovery programs through to settings now where the approach of the department's much more integrated across all species and identifying species that can act as flagships, but species that act as umbrellas as well for a whole suite of other things, and communities to ensure that we're getting good representation. So, essentially canvassing all of the state to know where all of the assets, the biodiversity assets lie, and then working at how we best protect each of them. So I think there's real change in terms of how we do things. Some of that's a bit behind the scenes, but then there's that other tier that we've been talking about, the social political will, the funding that drives it, the big decisions that drive those changes as well. Some of it, I think, our hand's going to be forced, and that's to think that that's likely to happen in my lifetime is a pretty scary concept. But I think, I do think we're already seeing the effects of climate change and the impacts on biodiversity. And so in the next couple of decades, some of those things will be very apparent to the vast majority of the population. And, sadly, for some, that's going to be the trigger to act as opposed to acting now. But some of that will, hopefully not too late, but some of that's going to drive some of that change as well.
What are the projects you're working on right at the moment that you're able to talk about?
Lots of exciting ones. Norfolk Island, we've just had Luke Halpin finish his PhD on the seabirds. So you mentioned pterodromas and foraging ecology. So he was working on white-necked petrels and kermidecs and black-winged petrels and understanding where they go to forage and what the threats might be, how successful they are with nests, and who eats them, which includes giant centipedes in burrows. We're working on Norfolk moorporks, so critically endangered form of a little forest owl that lives on Norfolk, and PhD student Flossie Spearing working there. Lots of other bits and pieces on the go. You touched on wind farms, and we're working with industry in a couple of spaces around transitioning to green energy, whilst also trying to get the very best outcomes for birds as part of that. So it is a reality that turbines and birds don't always mix well, and so how you get those wind farms designed so that you minimise impact on birds and other biodiversity, whilst also moving to green energies, a really important step in the mix as well.
And you mentioned a couple of the students that have got projects underway. I wonder, you've been involved for such a long time without painting you as an old man, because you're far from that. Do you have any sort of favourite projects, or some that you wish you could go back and maybe extend, that you don't feel like the work was done, or that we're in now, 10, 15 years down the track that you think need to be revisited?
Yeah, hard question. Lots of favourite projects, like a lot of the projects that I'm involved in, I've really enjoyed, both in terms of sort of that interaction and the system that we're working in, but also, hopefully in terms of having a positive impact, like learning more to be able to leave or provide managers with new information, or cracking the nut for the management tool that allows us to push forward. Some of those systems we've got out of because we've given it a good crack for 3-5 years, the life of a PhD or two, and we think we've broadly identified the solutions, and it's sort of over to the conservation managers to then run with it, with those solutions. Black-eared miners is probably a good example. There's always new bits of research that could be done, and there's a few tailored things that are being done. But back in my day when I was a PhD student, there were 3 PhDs that broadly worked across the space, and we broadly know what we need to do for black-eared miners in terms of management. We need to close dams, we need to reduce large-scale wildfires, we need to do some management of yellow-throated miners, and we need to manage feral herbivores in those systems. So basically we need to make the mallee better, more robust, to support the species that needs it. And so we could keep doing research there, but we're probably better off targeting other systems that there's big gaps in knowledge where some new insight would help change things materially and rapidly.
I know you love talking miners, so for the audience, the miners we're talking about are not Indian miners or related. They're a group of honey eaters. Now, with the black-eared miner, why is it in? It's probably overstating it to say in peril, but what are the threats? And you mentioned another miner. Tell us what the interactions are and what the problem is.
Yeah. So the key problem, the one that I've already touched on multiple times, is vegetation clearance. So once we had vast tracts of mallee, so this is a sort of short, stunted, multi-stemmed eucalypt woodland, and we had little patches of sort of open clearings in that, but vast tracts of this stuff. And you touched on it as well. We cleared the best stuff, and we keep the worst stuff. So the best stuff becomes farmland, and the worst stuff becomes reserve, and that's a legacy of land clearance practices, not necessarily by design for conservation reserves. By the time you start saying, let's have a conservation reserve here, all you've got left is the worst stuff. And so that's sort of the system we're in. And then it turns out that black-eared miners do really well in vast tracts of intact mallee. So the stuff that we've cleared is the stuff that they like. And there's another species called yellow-throated miner, which broadly the same, looks similar, has a white rump and has, lo and behold, a yellow throat and some other white markings around its head. And it likes open areas. So it would have been the species that hung out on the edges of plains, red gums next to creeks and things like that, and the edge of large tracts of mallee. So it's probable that black-eared miners and yellow-throated miners always came into contact with each other, but where they did, it didn't happen as frequently as it does now, and there were big populations of each species on either side. So a habitat preference kept them apart. Then we cleared it all, or we cleared lots of it, and yellow-throated miners massively intruded into black-eared miner territory, so to speak, and hybridization between those two forms became a much, much more common thing. And we can see it in the specimen record. So around 1950, which correlates really nicely with sort of heavy mechanization post-World War II.
Soldier settlements, yeah.
Yeah, all of that stuff. In the specimen record, we go from having a cluster of birds that look like black-eared miners, so this is museum specimens, and another cluster that look like yellow-throated miners, to a swarm of birds with a whole lot of things in the middle, specimens that look like intermediate birds that are, for all intents and purposes, things we call hybrids. And so that's what we see. And so to manage them, the more robust the habitat, the less watering points that yellow-throated miners seem to need, but black-eared miners don't. The better the shrub layer, so the less impact from herbivores, and the less direct contact with the yellow-throated miners, the better the black-eared miner populations are. And we haven't published on this, but recently we're seeing evidence that black-eared miners are holding their own in areas where that sort of management happens. So it's not to say that black-eared miners are out of peril, but if you do the right things to manage them and to manage the threat of yellow-throated miners, they are able to persist for multiple decades in a setting where if they were being hybridized, literally interbreeding every year, they would have disappeared by now.
Yeah. So there's a bit of good news there, and obviously more work needs to be done to monitor and to encourage the it's really repair of habitat now, isn't it, in those localities? So leave it alone, really.
So I guess it's multi-tiered, right? So the stuff we've got is absolutely precious. We should never accept clearing high quality habitat for anything. We don't need to.
No.
We should be looking other areas. And so that's first step. But then second step is maintenance and repair of that. And then the third step is growth. And they don't need to be done in a linear fashion. You can do them all at the same time in different places or at the same place to get good outcomes. So linking habitat with corridors and all of those sorts of things is part of that as well.
See, dear listener, we know what needs to be done. We just have to... I remember my parents saying something to the effect of, just get off your ass and do it, So, Mr. Government, Mrs., Ms. Government, get on with it. Rohan, are you ready?
I am.
What's your field guide of choice?
Oh, that's a dodgy question. I have to say the Australian Bird Guide. I wrote a decent portion of it with an awesome team.
I thought you were going to tell me that there's this other one. It's not really a field guide, but it really helps birders go about their daily business. We can't let the opportunity go about writing a book on where to find birds.
We could throw where to find birds in the mix as well. But I would say that all field guides have a place. We were talking about books at the start and the Good League. My go-to field guide was Graham Pizzey's field guide, Pizzey and Doyle. So the original one with the plates in the middle. And they shape generations of birders. So hopefully the Australian Bird Guide's around for a long time, but at some point there'll be another great field guide that'll replace it, and will it'll progress as it should.
And Rohan, I'll just go back to something we were speaking about earlier. I remember, was it the Herald Sun ran Graham Pizzey a couple of times a week?
He had a column. Yep.
He did, and we're not seeing anything like that now. Which, so, it, you know, he was famous. He was nature famous.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, off track. Come on, comms people. When you're out in the field, Rowan, what's the piece of equipment or the piece of kit that you just can't do without?
It's not within reach, but a pair of binoculars. Like, cannot do without a pair of binoculars.
Okay.
I rarely walk out the front door without a pair.
Um, are you with the lightweight compact variety now, or are you pretty much? I mean, what were mine? 7 by somethings. I can't remember, with a dodgy eyepiece that I had for, I don't know, 25 years, because you get attached to your pair of binoculars. What?
Yeah, I have a foot in both camps, so I have a pair of 10 by 40s or 10 by 42s, and perhaps ironically, they got destroyed, or the cover on them, the rubber armor on them, got destroyed by a shy albatross that we were tagging recently. And so they went off for repair. And so I have another pair at the moment, which are lighter weight. So I think they're 8 by 32s. So the 32 meaning they're substantially smaller, probably half the weight. Both great. Top end, good binoculars.
Yeah. I'm in the market for a new pair, and I'm horrified at how expensive a good pair is nowadays. I can sort of understand.
I'd argue they last a lifetime, but mine last about 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at them compared to what a spotting scope costs. I mean, the difference between a pair of really good binoculars and a spotting scope, 10, it's probably a dozen years ago when I was last in the market, the difference was astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's not that far apart for a decent spotting scope compared to a really good pair of binoculars. But if anyone out there, binocular companies doing sponsorships or anything, just saying. Do you take your mobile phone with you all the time? Are you logging on the go when you're out bird watching, or do you do all that stuff when you come back?
A mix. So it depends a lot on the setting. These days, probably like almost everyone, we carry our phones everywhere. It's our safety device and all sorts of other things. It's our GPS. The thing that I used to wear a backpack to carry is now in my hand as part of a thing that I use as a phone. So yes, I carry it, but on boats, for example, and we do quite a lot of vessel work, and I do a lot of bird watching on boats as well. I am old school and just take notes on boats. If I'm birding recreationally, then unfortunately I have my phone on me, and I would be punching it into eBird as I go, with a few little rules I have for how I put things in.
But there's so much more to talk to you about. I mean, we've hardly even mentioned seabirds, but slightly off track. I'd always thought of you as a bushbirds guy, but
I'm obsessed with seabirds, but and seabird ID. So, but we can leave that for later.
Actually, I have to ask you about that. When did that happen? Like, when did you become like a seabirder rather than just a birder?
90s at some point. Again, it's all a bit of a blur back then in terms of what I was up to. Getting out on a boat, and having spent the best part of a decade or more dreaming about seeing an albatross, or perhaps seeing something that's a speck on the horizon, and then having 50 albatross within 20 meters of the back of a boat, that stuff, it just hooks you, or it just hooked me. And seasickness comes and goes, but I can manage it. So I'm not one of those people that's like, never been sick, but I can handle boats. And so it's just, I guess it's the thing that excites me about it is it feels like frontier birding. So you go out on a boat and you can be an hour and a half off the coast of Victoria and you can be making new discoveries. And that's the same with island birding. It's the same with birding remote pockets of bush. In reality, it's the same as patch birding where you're birding areas that other people aren't birding. So finding new sites at a local level. All of that is kind of that, that sense of discovery and the sense of learning is one of the things that I really enjoy about birding.
Well, you had a pretty good get recently, didn't you?
We've been seeing some nice birds lately. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Which ones?
off Eagle Hawk.
Oh, we had a phenomenal trip or weekend off Eagle Hawk Neck in Tasmania just gone. Weekend just gone. Very large numbers of species. Most exciting birds were a New Zealand storm petrel, which is a bird that
came back from the dead, or just was imagined into existence.
Exactly. Described from specimens in the specimens collected in the 1800s of the description. Not seen alive pretty much until a mate found one in 2003. Now they're getting 80 in a flock off New Zealand, and we had one off Tasmania, which is super exciting. And then the other one was an Amsterdam albatross, so another bird that's sort of near mythical in terms of its tiny population size, the fact that it breeds on Amsterdam Island, the fact that there's fewer than 200 adults in the world. And so, one of those flew past the boat off Tasmania as a first record for Tasmania. Once we do all of the work of submitting it and the like, and the same, second or third record for Australia as well.
So on that trip, I'm guessing they were both lifers for you?
Lifers in an Australian context, absolutely. So new birds that I haven't seen in Australia before.
But not lifers on your life list.
I hadn't seen Amsterdam albatross before, but I have been lucky enough to go and do a little bit of work on New Zealand storm petrels.
Okay, so that's pretty good. Just a lazy,
that was a nice
trip off. Yeah, very good, very good. Okay, that I went far deeper on that than I expected, but it just goes to show, doesn't it, that any time you go out and you're looking, you can see something new, and that holds true for if you're bushwalking and you've never really noticed orchids, or you've never really taken the time to identify the eucalypts around you or grasses. You'll always find something new. So keep your eyes open.
100%.
So you've been birding a lot of places. What's your favourite place that you bird regularly and that you have ever birded?
Well, if there hadn't been a pandemic for the last couple of years, I could claim that I still bird Ashmore Reef regularly, in that I get there once or twice a year. That's easily my favourite place. It fits all of those things we were just talking about: frontier birding, sense of discovery, new things, not just in terms of new species, but understanding migration patterns and rare mainland birds that turn up halfway to Indonesia and things like that. But look, there's so many great places. Tasmanian Eagle Hawk Neck boat trips are something I do 3 times a year, and they are just so enjoyable as a birding expedition. And birding local patches. I live on the outskirts of Melbourne, and there's some fantastic little pockets of bush, the remnants that haven't been cleared, that still support some great birds. And it's the same stuff, that at that local level, that capacity to discover things and learn new things about birds is, that keeps you ticking, keeps you moving along.
So what's your bucket list location for birding?
Ooh, that's hard. it's probably somewhere remote. um, yeah, I don't know. I've been pretty fortunate, so yeah, don't necessarily have a list of all of the new places to go, but there's lots of lovely places to go back to.
Uh, have you ever been to the Galapagos?
No, I mean there's a whole world out there, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I could rattle off some places in South America that have obscene numbers of birds that could be species that could be seen in a day, or remarkable shorebird sites, or northern hemisphere pelagic opportunities where everything would be different. Yeah,
Is that actually? I'm straying from the format, Rowan. Excuse me, but is that something as a experienced working ecologist? Is that what you excites you? That you can still go to places where everything will be really different to what you know, and that you need to go through that whole learning process, that familiarizing yourself with what's there and what they do in that environment.
As a birder, that excites me. As an ecologist, that might worry me, because there's probably better people to do things in the systems that I don't know well. The people that are already familiar with it have already cracked a lot of those little nuts in terms of how things behave and interact. And so, yeah, working in systems that you have a good understanding of, or dipping into systems where you already know one or two species or a subset of the community really well, is where you can have the biggest impact. Starting with completely new systems might mean there's an interesting, exciting birding learning curve there, but it might also mean there's a lag of a few years before you start sort of having material impact in terms of the changes you can achieve that are good for species and systems and biodiversity.
I guess what I was really getting at was when you're out birding for pleasure, can you take your ecologist hat off and just keep your bird nerd hat on?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Good. Well, good. I wanted to make sure
Yeah.
that you could. So, what's your bucket list bird?
That would still have to be night parrot. I think there's something, the lost, the little sort of tenuous look into their world with those specimens that turned up in the 90s and 2000s to let us know that they're still there, but no confirmed sightings. And then the amazing discovery of the birds, and then what's come since in terms of populations being found in WA and elsewhere. So Queensland and WA as confirmed areas. It's just such an amazing story, and it all makes so much sense. And the early naturalists were so right in so much of what they said, but because we'd gone a generation or two without any good understanding, we were starting to not believe a lot of that. But behavior, calling activity, habitat, tick so many boxes. Interacting with them would be a pretty neat thing.
Well, you'll be very happy with one of the next episodes of the Bird Emergency if you're into the night parrot.
Fantastic.
I can give you a heads up on that. So, do you have a best bird, a favourite bird?
No, I always say because this is a common question, right? So it'd be normally something like flamingo, but I don't. There's so many great birds out there.
That's right. Every bird is the best bird.
And exactly. Yeah. Whatever you're looking at and experiencing at the time.
That's right. Every bird's the best bird, and especially the little brown bird.
Yep.
So well, that's great. We've got through a lot. I think, Rowan. Sorry if I got a bit too worked up there, and I'll have to take my pills, keep my blood pressure down. I don't know how I'm going to survive always talking about things that upset me so much. I mean, upset me, but give me so much joy as well. I think we've determined that you are a list keeper, but when you're out there in the field, not working, you're an experiential birder as much as a competitive list keeper. Actually, do you know your life number? There we go. That'll sort you out.
So globally, never.
Yeah. No.
Never worked it out.
Okay.
Nationally, I have an idea of where I fall, but not exactly. And I think that's probably also a reflection of change over time. More focused on twitching, listing, a little bit less focused on that now. But that's not to say that I don't get a massive buzz out of, seeing a new bird. It's all in the mix, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's always super exciting. When I get that buzz, that it's not competitive. I'm trying to get competitive. Have you heard of the bird a minute push? Have you?
I have. I've never gone down that. Let's call it a pathway. Yeah.
Well, pathway. Yeah, I think it's a gateway perhaps for some people, Rowan. I'm trying to get right into it, but I find it hard to bird at a pace. It's just not. That's just not my relationship with the birds. I have to stop and watch, and it doesn't matter if it's sparrows or willy wagtails or black-faced cuckoo shrike. Oh, look what it's doing with its wings. Isn't that interesting? Oh, look. I can't do it at a pace. I'm a terrible twitcher, terrible competitive twitcher. But I love that you're all out there.
Yeah, but what you've just said is should always be absolutely okay too, right? Like what birding means to an individual should be just what it means to that individual.
Absolutely. It's a community where we can all share our experiences, but we can't judge each other for the way we do it.
Absolutely.
That's crazy. That's crazy talk, man. That's crazy talk. Rowan, thanks. I really appreciate that you've taken so much time with me. We've hardly scratched the surface of the work you've done. I'd really like to, at some stage, follow up with you about the miners and emu wrens, just simply because it's something that the emu wren we've talked about before on the show, and it's going to be an ongoing management conundrum, I think, as fires. Not that they're more present in the landscape, but that they seem to be certainly more destructive in terms of totally obliterating working habitat sites. It's exterminating them rather than that progressive. What's the term I'm looking for? All those things have a progression over time that alters the habitat slightly, but not so much as to make it unlivable. But I think we're seeing it make it's cooking the habitat rather than altering the habitat.
Yeah, we're seeing big step changes, basically.
Yeah, so you can tell I'm not a scientist, mate, that I'm a horticulturist. Thanks so much, Rowan.
It's been a pleasure.
If people want to follow your work, what's the easiest way to keep an eye on what you're doing?
I hang out on Twitter a little bit, and we have a lab webpage. What else is there? The lab webpage is researchecology.com. So researchecology, all one word, .com.au. Yeah.
Okay. I'll link your Twitter handle too, Rowan.
Sounds great.
If you don't mind. Hopefully, no one's going to be a mad birder stalker. So. All right, that's been Dr. Rohan Clarke. I am Grant Williams. This has been the Bird Emergency. Thanks for being with us. Bye.